Rain drummed against the pavement, washing away the city's grime. But it couldn't wash away the exhaustion clinging to Clara. She only wanted 5 minutes of peace, half a turkey sandwich, a moment to breathe. She didn't ask for the bruised, silent stranger who collapsed onto the opposite end of her park bench. She didn't know the simple act of breaking her bread in two would tether her to the city's most ruthless predator. Kindness always exacts a heavy toll. Neon flickered through the heavy drizzle, casting long, bruised shadows across the damp concrete. Clara Hayes sat heavily on the splintering slats of the bus stop bench. She didn't care about the moisture seeping through her cheap wool coat. She didn't care that the street lamps were buzzing with a dying electric hum. Her shift at St. Jude's Emergency had been a 12-hour blur of fluorescent lights, screaming trauma monitors, and the cloying, inescapable scent of industrial bleach masking copper and bile. She opened the crumpled brown paper bag resting in her lap. Inside was a squashed turkey and Swiss on rye. The bread was stale. The edges of the cheese were hard. It was pathetic, but it was fuel. She peeled back the plastic wrap, her fingers numb from the November chill, and prepared to take a bite. Footsteps scraped against the pavement. They were uneven, heavy, dragging. Clara paused, her cynical city-dweller instincts flaring. She lived in a neighborhood where looking the wrong way could cost you your wallet or worse. Keep your head down, mind your business. That was the unwritten law of the streets. She focused her eyes strictly on her sandwich, chewing her first dry bite. A man practically fell onto the other end of the bench. The wood groaned under his sudden weight. He didn't look at her. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees, his head hanging between his shoulders. His breathing was a wet, ragged rasp that cut through the sound of the falling rain. Clara kept her gaze forward, but her peripheral vision drank in the details. He wore a dark wool overcoat that had clearly been expensive once, but was now ruined. It was torn at the shoulder, heavily stained with large, dark, wet patches that weren't just rainwater. His left hand was clamped tightly against his ribs. His right hand gripped the edge of the bench. The knuckles were split open, raw, weeping fluid and dirt. He didn't ask for help. He didn't make a sound other than that terrible, labored breathing. Clara took another bite of her sandwich. It tasted like ash. She was a nurse. She spent her days patching up gangbangers, overdose victims, and the collateral damage of the city's underbelly. She knew a losing fight when she saw one. She also knew that helping a man who looked like he had just crawled out of a shallow grave was a fast track to ending up in one herself. "Walk away," her brain ordered. "Your bus is coming in 10 minutes. Just stare straight ahead." The man shifted, a sharp hiss escaping his clenched teeth. His head tilted back against the bus stop ad, a faded, smiling lawyer promising compensation, and for a fraction of a second, the flickering street lamp illuminated his face, sharp jaw, bruised cheekbone. A split lip leaking dark fluid down his chin. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were half open, dark, and entirely hollow. He looked starved, not just for food, but for a reason to keep drawing air into his battered lungs. It was the look of a stray dog that had finally accepted the cold. Clara swallowed the dry bread. She looked at the remaining half of her sandwich. She looked at the man. "I don't have money," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. The man didn't react. He might not have even heard her over the rain. Clara sighed, a long, weary sound that held all the accumulated fatigue of her week. She unwrapped the sandwich entirely. With a sharp tear, she ripped it cleanly down the middle. She placed her half back in the bag. The other half she held out toward him. "Take it." The man turned his head slowly. The movement seemed to cost him immense physical effort. His dark eyes locked onto hers. There was no gratitude in them, only a cold, calculating suspicion. He looked from the sandwich to her face, searching for the trap. "It's just turkey and cheap cheese," Clara said, her tone flat, devoid of pity. "Pity got you killed. Pragmatism kept you alive. You look like you're going to pass out on my bench. I don't want to deal with the paramedics. Eat it." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with agonizing slowness, he reached out. His large, bruised hand dwarfed the half sandwich. His fingers brushed hers. He was freezing. He took the bread. He didn't say thank you. He brought it to his mouth and ate. It wasn't the ravenous, tearing bite of a starving man. It was deliberate, mechanical, chewing as if forcing his body to accept the calories. They sat in silence. The rain continued to fall. Two exhausted strangers on a wet bench, sharing a terrible sandwich in the dead of night. When the rumble of the late-night bus finally shook the pavement, Clara stood up. She gathered her bag, pulled her collar tight against the wind, and stepped toward the curb. She didn't look back at him. She climbed onto the bus, swiped her card, and took a seat near the back. As the bus pulled away, she glanced out the streaked window. The bench was empty. The alarm buzzed like an angry hornet at 5 a.m. Clara slammed her hand down on the plastic button, killing the noise. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the erratic clanking of the building's ancient radiator. The air in her cramped apartment was frigid. She threw off the thin quilt, shivering as her bare feet hit the warped linoleum floor. Routine took over. It had to. If she stopped to think about the mountain of past due bills on the kitchen counter, or the fact that her bank account currently held $34, she would fracture. She moved through the tiny space like a ghost haunting her own life. Shower, cold water, worn blue scrubs, a heavy sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs, keys, badge. She grabbed an apple from the fridge, her only breakfast, and locked the deadbolt behind her, rattling the handle twice out of habit. The stairwell smelled of stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. Clara descended the 4 flights quickly, her mind already running through the checklist of her upcoming shift. Bed 4 needed a dressing change. The Johnson kid would need his meds. She pushed open the heavy metal door leading out to the street. She stopped dead. The narrow, trash-strewn alleyway in front of her apartment building was usually empty at this hour, save for a few feral cats. Today it was entirely blocked. A sleek, matte black sedan idled silently in front of the curb. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in this zip code. It was a predator resting in a junkyard. 2 men stood beside it. One was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. He was broad-shouldered, with a broken nose and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The other man stood perfectly straight, facing her door. Clara felt the cold morning air punch the breath from her lungs. It was the man from the bench, except it wasn't. The hollow, bleeding stray from the night before was gone. In his place stood a monument to calculated violence. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit him with deadly precision. A black wool overcoat rested over his shoulders. His face was entirely clean, the split lip neatly stitched, the bruising hidden beneath the sharp angles of his jaw. His dark hair was swept back. He looked like power, raw, unadulterated power. Clara tightened her grip on her canvas tote bag. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her face perfectly blank. Panic was blood in the water. She stepped off the stoop, intending to walk right past them. The broad-shouldered man pushed off the hood of the car, stepping casually into her path. "Morning." Move, Clara said, her voice hard, flat. Dominic wants a word, the man replied, gesturing lazily toward the man in the suit. Clara looked at Dominic. He was watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Those same dark eyes from the night before, but now they were sharp, focused, entirely lucid. I don't know a Dominic, Clara said. I have a bus to catch in 4 minutes. Get out of my way. Dominic took a step forward. Even the way he moved was different now. Silent, fluid, predatory. Clara Hayes. His voice was a low, rough baritone. It scraped along her nerves. 26. ER nurse at St. Jude's. You live in apartment 4B. Your heat is broken. A cold spike of genuine terror drove itself into her spine. Who the hell are you? Dominic didn't smile. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Clara instinctively braced herself, but he pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope. He held it out to her. A debt paid, he said. Clara looked at the envelope. It was thick, very thick. I don't want your money. It's not a request. Neither is my telling you to move, Clara snapped, her exhaustion briefly overriding her fear. I gave a bleeding man half a sandwich because I didn't want him to die on my bus stop. That's it. There's no debt. There's no transaction. We are done here. The broad-shouldered man chuckled, a low, grating sound. She's got teeth, Dom. Dominic silenced him with a single, fractional look. He turned his attention back to Clara. He didn't lower his hand. Take the money, Clara. Pay your rent. Fix your heat. How do you know my name? She demanded, stepping back. How do you know where I live? I know everything that happens in my city, Dominic said quietly. Take the envelope. No. Clara walked around him, forcing herself not to run. She stepped off the curb, her boots splashing in a shallow puddle. She expected a hand to grab her shoulder, expected to be dragged into the black car. But nothing happened. She walked quickly down the street, turning the corner without looking back. When she finally reached the bus stop, her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her badge twice. Back in the alley, Arthur Costa tossed his cigarette onto the wet pavement and crushed it beneath his heel. He looked at his boss. Dominic Russo was still standing there, holding the rejected envelope, watching the empty space where Clara had disappeared. Well, Arthur said lightly, that went well. Usually people cry when you hand them 10 grand. Dominic slowly lowered his arm. He slid the envelope back into his coat. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. Find out what time her shift ends, Dominic said, turning toward the car. Dom, you're supposed to be dead, Arthur reminded him gently. The Moretti family thinks they put 6 bullets in you last night. The commission is scrambling. We need to go to ground, not stalk a nurse. I am not stalking her, Dominic said, slipping into the back seat. She's under my protection now. Arthur sighed, climbing into the driver's seat. She doesn't want your protection. Dominic looked out the tinted window at the crumbling brick of Clara's apartment building. She doesn't know she needs it yet. The emergency room was a war zone. By 2 p.m., Clara was running on adrenaline and stale coffee. A multi-car pileup on the interstate had flooded the trauma bays, and the waiting room was a sea of coughing, bleeding, angry humanity. She moved from bed to bed, checking vitals, pushing IVs, speaking in the soothing, detached voice she had perfected over 4 years. "Pressure's dropping in Bay 3, a resident shouted. Clara pivoted, sprinting toward the curtained area. She didn't have time to think about the black car. She didn't have time to think about Dominic Russo. Work was her sanctuary, a chaotic, bloody place where the rules were clear, and survival was a matter of science, not power. It wasn't until she finally took her mandatory 15-minute break at 6 p.m. that the outside world bled in. She collapsed into a plastic chair in the cramped break room, rubbing her aching temples. The small TV mounted in the corner was muted, flashing breaking news graphics. Two of the older nurses, Sarah and Jenkins, were huddled over a tablet, whispering frantically. "They found 3 more bodies down at the docks," Sarah was saying, her voice hushed. "Execution style. It's a full-blown war." "It's the Russos," Jenkins replied, shaking his head. "Word on the street is someone tried to hit the boss last night. Ambushed him leaving a restaurant. Killed his driver, put a few in him. He vanished. Now his people are tearing the city apart, looking for whoever ordered the hit." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She looked up at the muted TV screen. A photo was displayed next to the anchor. It was a mugshot, a few years old, but unmistakable. Sharp jaw, dark, hollow eyes. Dominic Russo. The caption beneath read, "Mob boss feared dead in syndicate ambush." Clara stopped breathing. The bruised, bleeding man on the bench. The expensive suit. The $10,000 in an envelope. She hadn't saved a stray dog. She had fed a wolf. "You okay, Clara?" Sarah asked, noticing her pale face. "You look like you're going to hurl." "Fine," Clara lied, her voice tight. "Just tired. Really tired." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the tile. She needed air. She needed to leave. But she still had 3 hours left on her shift. The rest of the evening was a blur of paranoid anxiety. Every time the heavy double doors of the ER swung open, Clara flinched, expecting to see men in dark suits carrying guns. She kept her head down, avoiding the waiting room, hiding behind the nurses' station whenever possible. By 9 p.m., she was practically vibrating with exhaustion and fear. She clocked out, grabbed her coat, and took the staff exit out the back of the hospital. It was darker here, less crowded. She practically ran toward the bus stop. She didn't make it. As she rounded the corner of the loading dock, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Clara gasped, dropping her tote bag, her hand instinctively reaching into her pocket for the small canister of pepper spray she carried. "Easy, sweetheart," a familiar grating voice said. It was the broad-shouldered man, Arthur. He had his hands raised, palms open, showing he was unarmed. But the casual way he stood, blocking her only exit, screamed danger. "Get away from me," Clara hissed, pulling out the pepper spray. Her thumb hovered over the trigger. "I will spray you, I swear to God." Arthur didn't even flinch. He looked at the tiny pink canister and sighed. "That's cute. Look, Clara, right? I'm not here to hurt you. If I wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't have seen me." "What do you want?" "Dom wants to see you." "I told him this morning. We have nothing to talk about. I don't want his money." "It's not about the money anymore," Arthur said, his tones dropping the amused edge. He sounded tired now. "You were seen." Clara froze. "What?" "Last night. The alley near the park. A camera picked up Dom walking toward the bus stop. It picked you up sitting there. It picked up the two of you interacting." Arthur took a slow step forward. "The people who shot him. They're looking for him. And now they're looking for you." "That's insane," Clara whispered, her mind racing. "I'm a nurse. I don't know anything." "They don't care," Arthur said bluntly. "To them, you're a loose end. You might have seen where he went. You might know who he called. In our world, loose ends get clipped. Dom isn't going to let that happen." "I am not a part of your world," Clara yelled, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "You are now," a quiet voice said from behind Arthur. Dominic stepped out of the shadows. He was wearing a different suit, dark navy, blending into the night. His presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the alley. He didn't look at Arthur. His eyes were fixed entirely on Clara. "Get in the car, Clara." "No." She backed up against the cold brick wall. "I'm going home. I'm going to lock my door. I have a shift tomorrow. If you go home tonight, you will be dead by morning," Dominic stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a terrifying, absolute fact. "They already hit your apartment an hour ago, tore the place apart. If you had been there..." He let the sentence hang in the damp air. Clara felt her knees go weak. Her sanctuary, her tiny, miserable, safe apartment. "You're lying." Dominic pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up. It was a photo. Her front door kicked off its hinges. Her cheap furniture overturned. Her mattress slashed. A choked sob escaped Clara's throat before she could stop it. Her hands began to tremble violently. She dropped the pepper spray. It clattered uselessly against the concrete. Dominic stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a heavy blanket of authority. "I brought this to your door," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly soft, devoid of the cold command he used with Arthur. "I didn't mean to, but I did, and I pay my debts." He held his hand out towards the street, where the matte black sedan was idling quietly. "You shared your bread with me when I was a dead man walking," Dominic said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, anchoring her panicked mind. "Now you are under my protection. No one touches what is mine. Get in the car." Clara looked at the dark street. She looked at the photo on the phone. She had no home. She had no family in the city. She had $34 and a ruined life. She looked at Dominic Rousseau, the predator who had suddenly appointed himself her guardian. Slowly, her hands shaking, Clara picked up her tote bag. She walked past Arthur, who gave her a solemn nod, and approached the car. Dominic opened the rear door for her. She slid into the plush leather interior, the scent of expensive cologne and danger instantly surrounding her. Dominic got in beside her, the door shut with a heavy, final thud. The trap had sprung, and Clara had walked right into it. The city blurred past the tinted windows of the sedan, a smeared canvas of neon and rain. Clara sat rigidly against the leather door panel, putting as much distance between herself and Dominic as the back seat allowed. The silence in the car was heavy, oppressive. It felt like the pressurized cabin of an airplane right before a crash. Dominic didn't try to fill it. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, tracking the headlights in the distance. He was a man accustomed to total control, and right now, his quiet vigilance was more terrifying than any threat. They didn't pull up to a sprawling suburban mansion with iron gates. The car descended into a subterranean parking garage beneath a towering, brutalist high-rise in the financial district. The concrete pillars were thick, the lighting harsh and fluorescent. Arthur killed the engine. The silence that followed rang in Clara's ears. "We're here," Arthur grunted, stepping out to scan the perimeter before opening Dominic's door. Dominic stepped out, then held the door for Clara. She ignored his outstretched hand, climbing out on unsteady legs. Her scrubs felt tissue-thin in the damp, subterranean air. "Where is here?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Safe house," Dominic replied shortly, leading the way toward a steel service elevator. "Owned by a shell corporation. No one knows I have it. No one knows you're here." He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner beside the elevator doors. The machine beeped a flat, green affirmative. The heavy steel doors slid open with a heavy mechanical groan. Clara hesitated. Stepping into that metal box felt like stepping into a tomb. But the memory of her shattered apartment door flashed behind her eyes. She had nowhere else to go. She stepped inside, crossing her arms over her chest, to stop her violent shivering. The ride up was entirely silent. The numbers above the door ticked past 40. When the doors parted, they didn't open into a hallway. They opened directly into a sprawling penthouse. It wasn't opulent, it was clinical. Stark white walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows covered by heavy, motorized blackout blinds. The furniture was minimalist, black leather and chrome, arranged precisely. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end waiting room. Arthur walked past them, immediately checking the locks on the heavy steel front door and cycling the security feeds on a wall-mounted tablet. "Guest room is down the hall, last door on the right," Dominic said, shrugging off his wool overcoat and tossing it over a chair. "There's an attached bathroom. The closet has clothes, clean, never worn, mostly basics. They should fit." Clara stood frozen in the center of the vast, empty room. The adrenaline that had carried her from the hospital alleyway was rapidly burning off, leaving a hollow, scraping exhaustion in its wake. "I have a shift tomorrow," she said. The words sounded absurd even to her, but she desperately needed something normal to cling to. "At the hospital. I have a 12-hour shift." Dominic turned to face her. He began unbuttoning his suit jacket. "You don't have a job anymore, Clara. You can't go back to St. Jude's. You can't make that decision for me." Her voice trembled, pitching up with rising panic. "I am a nurse. I have patients. I have bills. You can't just abduct me and tell me my life is over. Your life was over the second the Moretti family saw you on that camera," Dominic said smoothly, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. "If you walk into that hospital tomorrow, you won't walk out. They will wait for you to finish your shift. They will put a bullet in the back of your head in the parking garage. Or worse, they'll take you alive to see what you know about me." "I don't know anything about you," Clara shouted, the raw sound tearing from her throat. "I gave you half a sandwich. To them, that makes you an associate. In this life, perception is reality." He took a step toward her, his tone dropping, losing its sharp edge. "I am sorry, I truly am. But you are here because it is the only place you will survive the week." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to scream until her lungs gave out. But she looked at the cold, hard set of his eyes and knew it would be useless. He wasn't a man who yielded to emotion. He dealt in hard, brutal facts, and the fact was, she was completely at his mercy. She spun around, her boots squeaking sharply on the polished concrete, and marched down the hallway. She found the last door on the right, stepped inside, and slammed it shut behind her. She found the lock. She turned it until it clicked. Only then did her knees buckle. She slid down the solid wood of the door, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears were silent, ugly, and born entirely of profound, absolute terror. The clock on the bedside table glared red. 3:14 a.m. Clara hadn't slept. She had showered, the scalding water washing away the smell of the hospital and the street, and changed into a pair of soft grey sweatpants and a black t-shirt she found in the closet. They were too big, swallowing her small frame, but they were warm. She lay on top of the covers of the massive king-sized bed, staring at the blank ceiling. Every creak of the building settling, every rush of wind against the reinforced glass made her muscles twitch. Her mouth was completely dry. She sat up, pushing her tangled hair out of her face. She needed water. She couldn't stay cowering in this room forever. Unlocking the door softly, she stepped out into the hallway. The penthouse was mostly dark, illuminated only by the faint, ambient glow of the city seeping around the edges of the blackout blinds. She padded barefoot toward what she assumed was the kitchen. As she rounded the corner, she stopped. A single pendant light was on above the massive marble kitchen island. Dominic was standing there. He had stripped off his suit jacket, tie, and dress shirt. He was wearing only a white undershirt, and his back was to her. He was leaning heavily against the marble counter, his head bowed. His breathing was shallow and uneven, the same wet, ragged rasp she had heard on the bench in the rain. Clara took a step back, intending to retreat to her room. Then she saw the red. It was seeping through the stark white fabric of his undershirt, a rapidly expanding stain just below his left ribs. It was fresh. It was heavy. Her cynical survival instinct screamed at her to turn around. Not your circus, not your monkeys. Let the mob boss bleed. But 4 years in the ER had rewired her brain. Bleeding was a puzzle that needed solving. A failing body was a machine that needed to be stabilized. "You're bleeding through your shirt," she said. Dominic flinched. The movement was sharp, involuntary, and clearly caused him excruciating pain. He turned his head slowly to look at her. His face was a mask of grey wax. Sweat beaded on his forehead and upper lip. The polished, untouchable predator from the alleyway was gone, replaced once again by the battered, failing human. "It's nothing," he managed to say, his voice strained tight. "Go back to sleep, Clara. I deal with nothing for a living." "That's arterial, or close to it," Clara said, stepping fully into the kitchen. Her fear evaporated, replaced by cold, clinical focus. This territory she knew. "Take the shirt off." "I have a doctor. Arthur is calling him." "Arthur isn't here, and unless your doctor has a helicopter, he's not getting here fast enough to stop you from going into hypovolemic shock on your expensive marble floor." She walked right up to him. She didn't flinch away from his size or his reputation. She looked directly at the stain. "Take it off." Dominic stared down at her. For a second, defiance hardened his jaw. Then a fresh wave of pain hit him, and his shoulders sagged. With agonizing slowness, he pulled the ruined undershirt over his head, dropping it onto the counter. Clara inhaled sharply. His torso was a map of violence. Old scars, knife wounds, bullet puckers crisscrossed his heavy musculature. But the immediate problem was on his left side. A crude, hasty line of black sutures held together a jagged tear just below his ribcage. Several of the stitches had torn completely through the flesh. The wound was yawning open, dark blood sluggishly welling up and spilling down his side. "Whoever stitched this is an idiot," Clara muttered, stepping closer to inspect the damage. "They used the wrong gauge thread, and the tension is entirely uneven. The moment you moved too fast, you ripped the fascia." "It was done in the back of a moving van," Dominic grunted, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the counter to keep himself upright. "Where is your first aid kit?" "Bathroom down the hall." Clara moved quickly. She found the kit, a large, heavy-duty trauma bag, predictably well stocked for a man in his line of work. She hauled it back to the kitchen and dropped it onto the island. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to one of the high leather bar stools. Dominic didn't argue. He practically collapsed onto the seat. Clara washed her hands at the sink, snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves from the kit, and pulled out saline, sterile gauze, a local anesthetic syringe, and a fresh suture kit. "This is going to burn," she warned, uncapping the saline. She didn't wait for him to brace himself. She flushed the open wound heavily. Dominic hissed, a sharp intake of air through his teeth. His hand clamped onto the edge of the marble, his knuckles turning bone white. But he didn't pull away. He didn't make another sound. Clara worked with rapid, practiced efficiency. She assessed the depth of the tear. It was deep, but it hadn't punctured anything vital. It just needed to be closed properly. "I need to numb the margins before I restitch it," she said, tapping the syringe. "Look away." "I've had worse," he murmured, his dark eyes fixed on her face, not the needle. "Congratulations. You still get lidocaine." She injected the anesthetic around the edges of the torn flesh. Silence descended on the kitchen, broken only by the sharp, metallic snip of her surgical scissors, cutting away the ruined thread. She leaned in close. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. She could smell the metallic tang of his blood mixed with the faint scent of rain that still clung to his hair. He was massive, a weapon of a man, and yet, sitting here under the harsh pendant light, he was entirely at her mercy. "Why did you come to my street?" Clara asked softly, her eyes focused entirely on guiding the curved needle through his flesh. She tied off a knot with sharp, tight precision. "You could have sent your man to drop off the money. You didn't have to be there." Dominic watched her hands. Small, pale, steady. They were the exact opposite of the hands that usually touched him. "I don't leave debts unsettled," he said. "It was half a sandwich. It was the first time in 10 years someone gave me something without expecting anything in return," Dominic corrected quietly. "I had to see you again, to see if you were real." Clara paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She looked up. Their faces were mere inches apart. The cynical, hardened barrier she kept carefully erected around her heart faltered for a fraction of a second. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, mirroring her own. "I'm real," she whispered. "And now I'm trapped." "You're alive," he countered softly. "I intend to keep you that way." Clara swallowed hard, breaking the gaze. She looked back down at the wound. "Hold still. I have 4 more stitches to go." She finished the row, applying a heavy layer of surgical glue over the knots to reinforce them before taping a thick square of sterile gauze over the site. She stripped off her bloody gloves and tossed them into the trash. "Keep it dry. Don't lift anything heavier than a coffee cup," she instructed, her voice reverting to her detached, professional tone. "I'll check it again tomorrow." Dominic looked down at the neat, professional dressing. He reached out, his hand wrapping gently around her wrist before she could pull completely away. His skin was hot against hers. "Thank you, Clara." It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was the sincere gratitude of a man who rarely had a reason to offer it. Clara gently pulled her wrist free. She didn't smile. "Go to sleep, Dominic." She turned and walked back to her room, leaving the predator alone in the dark. Morning arrived without fanfare. No shrieking alarm clock, no clanking radiator. Clara opened her eyes to a ceiling of pristine, unblemished drywall. For 3 seconds, she was simply a woman, waking up in a remarkably comfortable bed. Then the memories crashed down like falling masonry. The alleyway, the gunshots she hadn't heard but knew were fired, the torn flesh under her hands. She sat up quickly, her pulse spiking. The oversized t-shirt slipped off her shoulder. The room was utterly silent, the heavy motorized blinds sealing out the daylight and the city below. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cold, polished concrete floor. It grounded her. She checked the digital clock on the nightstand. 8:15 a.m. Her shift at St. Jude's had started 15 minutes ago. A sharp, physical ache gripped her chest. It was the frantic anxiety of the chronically responsible. Someone else was covering her station. Bed 4 was probably throwing a fit. The charge nurse was cursing her name. She had never missed a shift in 4 years. Not for the flu, not for the blizzard of 24, not for anything. Clara marched out of the bedroom, her jaw set. The penthouse was filled with the rich, dark scent of freshly ground espresso and frying bacon. It felt entirely wrong. Criminals were supposed to hide in dank basements, not cook breakfast in a kitchen that belonged in an architectural digest. Arthur was standing at the stove, using a pair of silver tongs to flip thick cuts of bacon. He wore a dark, casual Henley, a shoulder holster strapped unapologetically over his chest. The heavy black pistol resting against his ribs was a stark contrast to the domesticity of the frying pan. He glanced over his shoulder as she walked in. "Morning, Florence Nightingale. Sleep?" "Where is my phone?" Clara demanded, ignoring his question. She scanned the marble island. Her canvas tote bag was sitting on a bar stool, looking pathetic and entirely out of place. "Gone," a voice answered. Clara turned. Dominic was sitting in a low leather armchair in the adjoining living area. He wore dark slacks and a black, long-sleeved shirt that hid the bandages entirely. A sleek laptop rested on his knees. He looked pale, the edges of his mouth tight with suppressed pain, but his posture was rigid, refusing to yield to the injury she had stitched closed hours ago. "What do you mean, gone?" Clara stepped into the living room. Her fear was rapidly being eclipsed by a profound, building rage. "I need to call my charge nurse. I need to tell them I'm alive. I need to quit properly." "You don't need to do anything," Dominic said, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. "Your phone was a tracking risk. I had Arthur smash it and drop it in a storm drain 3 miles from here. As for St. Jude's, they received an email from your account at 6 a.m. stating you had a family emergency out of state and were resigning immediately." Clara stood frozen. "You hacked my email." "I had someone log in, yes." He finally looked up at her. His expression was maddeningly calm. "I also had them wire a severance package to your landlord to break your lease and clear the remaining balance on your student loans." The air left Clara's lungs. It felt like a physical blow. She braced a hand against the back of the leather sofa. "You cleared my debt," she whispered, the words tasting like copper. Arthur slid a plate of eggs and bacon onto the counter behind her. The clatter of ceramic was loud in the tense silence. $52,000, Dominic stated, his tone flat, businesslike. "It was the least I could do for pulling you into this." "How dare you?" The words tore out of her, raw and shaking. Dominic's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking his composed facade. He was a man who bought loyalty, who traded in leverage and cash. He expected relief. He expected gratitude. Clara closed the distance between them, pointing a shaking finger at his chest. "I worked double shifts for 4 years to pay that down. I ate stale bread so I wouldn't have to owe anyone a dime. It was mine, my debt, my life. You don't get to just erase it with a keyboard stroke and decide you own me." Arthur tensed by the kitchen island, his hand dropping subtly toward his hip. Clara didn't care. She was too angry to be afraid. "I don't own you, Clara," Dominic said quietly. He closed the laptop and set it on the glass coffee table. "I'm keeping you alive. If you walked into that hospital, you would be a corpse by lunchtime. The Morettis hit 3 of my fronts last night. They burned out a warehouse. They are hunting. I am not a soldier in your war. No, you are collateral." Dominic leaned forward, wincing slightly as the stitches pulled against his skin. His dark eyes locked onto hers, holding her gaze with terrifying intensity. "And I do not accept collateral damage, not when it's caused by me. You are angry, be angry, but be alive to feel it." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. She wanted to scream, she wanted to hit him. But the cold logic in his eyes was impenetrable. He had dismantled her entire life before breakfast, systematically removing every trace of Clara Hayes from the city's grid. She was a ghost. She turned on her heel and walked to the kitchen island. She didn't look at Arthur as she grabbed a piece of bacon from the plate he had poured. She took a vicious bite, the salt and grease coating her tongue. "I'm checking your stitches at noon," she said over her shoulder, her voice hard. "If you tear them, I'm not using anesthetic the second time." She walked back to her room and shut the door. In the living room, Arthur let out a low whistle. He picked up his mug of espresso. "She's not exactly kissing the ring, boss." Dominic watched the closed door of the guest room. The tightness around his mouth relaxed just a fraction. "No," he murmured softly. "She isn't." 3 days bled into one another, trapped in a sensory deprivation tank built of glass and concrete. The penthouse became a pressure cooker. Clara paced the length of the living room, tracing the same invisible path along the polished floorboards until her muscles ached. She watched the news on the massive flat-screen television. The city was bleeding. A car bomb in the garment district, a shootout in a restaurant kitchen. The media called it a surge in gang violence. Clara knew it was a hunt. Dominic ran the war from the dining table. He operated entirely through burner phones, breaking them in half and tossing them into a metal wastebasket after a single use. Arthur was his shadow, filtering information, moving weapons, coordinating men whose names Clara never heard. She watched Dominic operate. It was horrifyingly familiar. In the emergency room, Clara worked under a system of triage. You prioritized the bleeding. You ignored the screaming patient with the broken arm to focus on the quiet patient with the punctured lung. You made cold, rapid calculations about who could be saved and who was already gone. Dominic was doing the exact same thing. "Cut off the supply line at the docks," Dominic said into a cheap plastic phone, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Let them take the warehouse on 4th. It's empty anyway. Bleed their manpower holding a useless asset." He hung up, snapped the phone and tossed it away. He looked exhausted. The grey pallor hadn't left his skin since the night she stitched him up. "You're running a fever," Clara said from her spot on the sofa. Dominic didn't look up from the sprawling map of the city spread across the table. "I'm fine." "You're sweating in a 68-degree room and your breathing is shallow," Clara countered, standing up. She walked over to the trauma kit resting on the kitchen counter, pulled out a digital thermometer and walked over to the table. "Open." Dominic finally looked at her. His eyes were heavy, ringed with dark, bruised exhaustion. He looked at the plastic device in her hand, then up at her face. He didn't argue. He opened his mouth. Clara slid the thermometer under his tongue. They waited in silence for the beep. When it sounded, she pulled it out and checked the digital display. 101.4, she announced grimly. "The site is infected. You need antibiotics." "I took some amoxicillin Arthur brought," Dominic muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Amoxicillin won't touch a deep tissue infection caused by whatever filthy knife or bullet grazed you before you got stitched up in a moving van," Clara said, her tone slipping entirely back into her ER persona. "You need broad-spectrum IV antibiotics, or you're going to go into sepsis." "I can't go to a hospital," Dominic said. "I know," Clara snapped, "because people are trying to kill you, which makes dying of a staph infection incredibly ironic." She turned to Arthur, who was standing by the window. "I need ceftriaxone, a bag of normal saline, IV tubing, and a 20-gauge catheter. Can you get it?" Arthur looked at Dominic. Dominic gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. "Give me an hour," Arthur said, grabbing his coat. The heavy steel door locked securely behind him. Clara and Dominic were alone. The silence stretched between them. heavy with the hum of the city far below. Clara pulled out a fresh pair of gloves and walked over to the table. "Take off the shirt, let me look at it." Dominic unbuttoned his shirt, the movements stiff. He pushed the fabric back, revealing the thick gauze pad taped to his side. Clara gently peeled the surgical tape away. She didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. The skin around the sutures was angry, swollen, and radiating a dark, bruised red. It was hot to the touch. "It's ugly," Clara murmured, pressing gently around the margins to check for fluid buildup. Dominic hissed, his abdominal muscles clenching. "I've survived worse." "That's a terrible metric for healthcare," Clara said, grabbing an alcohol swab to clean the surrounding skin. "Why are they hunting you? The Morettis? Why this week? Why burn half the city down?" She didn't know why she asked. Survival dictated she should know as little as possible. But the isolation was stripping away her defenses. Dominic watched her hands working over his skin. "Carlo Moretti died last month. Heart attack. His son, Leo, took over. Leo is young. He's impulsive. He thinks peace is a sign of weakness. He wants to consolidate the territories, and I hold the ports. So he tried to kill you," Clara clarified, taping a fresh, sterile pad over the angry wound. "And because he failed, he's tearing the city apart to finish the job. If I die, my capos splinter. The territory fractures. Leo walks in and picks up the pieces." Dominic leaned his head back against the chair, closing his eyes. The fever was clearly draining him. "He paid someone inside my circle. That's how he knew my route leaving the restaurant. That's why I can't leave this room. I don't know who bought the bullet." Clara paused, her hands resting on the edge of the table. She looked at his face. Stripped of the suit, stripped of the terrifying aura of command, he was just a man boxed into a corner, betrayed by his own, fighting a fever and a war at the same time. "You're a prisoner too," she said softly. Dominic opened his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the cynical, exhausted nurse who had given him half her dinner. He saw the woman whose life he had ruined to save. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, raw pitch. "But my cage is of my own making, Clara. Yours was built by me." He reached out, his hot, rough fingers brushing against her knuckles where they rested on the table. It was a fleeting, terrifyingly gentle touch. "I will get you out of it," he promised. "When the blood stops running, I will give you your life back." Clara looked down at his hand. She didn't pull away. "My life is gone, Dominic," she said, the fight finally bleeding out of her voice. "Now we just have to make sure we survive this one." Arthur returned 40 minutes later. He dumped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the kitchen island, his breathing slightly elevated, rain dripping from his leather jacket. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were glued to the security monitors on the wall. "Got it. Had to wake up a very unhappy veterinarian in Queens," Arthur muttered, cycling through the camera feeds. "Anything happen?" "His fever spiked," Clara said, already unzipping the bag. She pulled out the crinkling plastic of the normal saline bag, the IV tubing, and the small glass vial of ceftriaxone. She worked with ruthless efficiency. She found a heavy floor lamp in the living room, stripped the shade off, and dragged it beside Dominic's chair to act as a makeshift IV pole. She prepped the line, tapping the plastic tubing to clear the air bubbles. Dominic watched her, his eyes glassy with fever, but his focus unwavering. "Make a fist," she ordered, tying a rubber tourniquet around his heavy bicep. He complied. His veins rose against the pale skin of his forearm. Clara swabbed the crook of his elbow with alcohol, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the stale air of the apartment. She uncapped the needle. Sharp pinch. She slid the 20-gauge catheter into the vein with practiced ease, watching for the flash of red in the chamber before advancing the plastic tube and withdrawing the needle. She taped it down securely and connected the line. "Antibiotics are going in," she said, adjusting the drip rate. "You should start feeling it in a few hours." Dominic leaned his head back, closing his eyes. The tension in his jaw relaxed fractionally. "You are very good at your job, Clara." "I was," she corrected bitterly. She sank onto the sofa opposite him, pulling her knees to her chest. "Now I'm practicing unlicensed medicine on a mob boss in a secret tower." The apartment fell quiet, save for the rhythmic dripping of the IV chamber and the low hum of the refrigerator. Arthur remained stationed by the door, a silent sentinel, his eyes locked on the digital feeds. "I didn't choose this, you know," Dominic said quietly, his eyes still closed. Clara looked at him. "Nobody forced you to become what you are. My father was a soldier for the old families. He died in a shootout over a rigged card game when I was 12. Left my mother with nothing but gambling debts and a target on her back." Dominic's voice was a rough, hypnotic rasp. "The men he owed came to collect. I took a kitchen knife and put it through the throat of the man who grabbed her." Clara stopped breathing. "I was 12, Dominic repeated, finally opening his eyes to look at her. The fever made his gaze unnervingly vulnerable. "The boss of the family saw it. He didn't kill me. He saw a feral dog that could be trained. He paid my mother's debts and he owned me. I spent the next 20 years climbing over bodies to make sure no one could ever walk into my house and demand a debt again." He looked at the plastic bag hanging from the floor lamp. "Power isn't about luxury, Clara. It's about insulation. It's a wall between you and the men who want to take what's yours." "And what happens when the wall breaks?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, the wall-mounted security tablet let out a sharp, piercing shriek. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. A solid red block flashed across the screen. Arthur was moving before the second chime finished. He racked the slide of his pistol, his face draining of color. "Proximity breach in the parking garage," Arthur barked, his fingers flying across the tablet. 2 heavily armored SUVs just blew through the security gate. 10 men, long guns. Dominic ripped the IV out of his arm. A spray of dark fluid dotted the polished floorboards. He didn't flinch. He grabbed a wad of gauze, pressing it against his elbow, and stood up. The fever swayed him for a fraction of a second, but sheer primal adrenaline forced his body into submission. "How did they find us?" Clara panicked, scrambling to her feet. "They didn't find us," Dominic said, walking towards the hallway closet. He pulled out a heavy ballistic vest and a submachine gun. "They were given the address." Arthur swore viciously. "The veterinarian." Leo Moretti cast a wide net. "He put a bounty on medical supplies moving underground," Dominic stated coldly, chambering around. "We have less than 2 minutes." Fear wasn't a cold chill. It was a physical weight crushing Clara's lungs. The clinical detachment that kept her functioning in the ER shattered. Men with rifles were coming to kill them. "Shoes. Coat. Now," Dominic ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. The vulnerable, feverish man from 30 seconds ago was entirely gone. He was a machine built for war. Clara sprinted to the guest room, shoving her feet into her heavy boots and grabbing the oversized coat. When she ran back out, Arthur was pulling a heavy steel lock bar across the main door. "That will hold them for 60 seconds if they have breaching charges," Arthur said, his eyes scanning the room. "We can't use the main elevator. They'll kill the power." "Service stairs," Dominic said. He looked at Clara. He didn't offer her a gun. He knew it would only be a liability. Instead, He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip bruisingly tight. "You stay behind me. You do not stop moving. If I fall, you follow Arthur. Do you understand?" Clara couldn't speak. Her throat was completely sealed. She nodded rapidly. The first heavy thud hit the steel door. It vibrated through the floorboards. Dominic pushed her towards the kitchen. They bypassed the main entrance entirely, moving toward a secondary door hidden behind the pantry shelving. Arthur punched a code into a keypad, and the shelving unit swung outward, revealing a dark, concrete stairwell. Another massive boom echoed through the penthouse. The lock bar groaned, bending inward. They slipped into the stairwell. Arthur pulled the heavy door shut, locking it from the inside. The air in the stairwell was freezing, smelling of dust and old concrete. 40 floors down," Arthur whispered, clicking a small flashlight on. Quietly, they descended. The only sound was the rapid squeak of Clara's boots and the heavy, controlled breathing of the two men. Dominic moved stiffly, his left hand clamped tightly over his wounded side, but his pace never faltered. By floor 30, Clara's thighs were burning. By floor 20, her lungs were screaming. At floor 15, the stairwell door above them blew open with a concussive roar that sent a shockwave of dust down the shaft. "They're in the stairwell," Arthur hissed. "Go," Dominic barked, pushing Clara forward. The descent became a frantic, uncontrolled scramble. Heavy boots pounded on the metal grates above them. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness like frantic, searching fingers. A gunshot cracked. The sound was trapped in the concrete cylinder, amplifying into a deafening physical blow. A bullet sparked off the railing inches from Clara's head, spraying hot metal shavings against her cheek. She screamed, stumbling forward. Dominic caught her by the collar of her coat, hauling her upright and throwing her down the next flight of stairs. "Keep moving!" he roared, turning back up the stairwell. He raised his weapon and fired a 3-round burst upward. A heavy body tumbled down the stairs above them, crashing into a landing with a sickening crunch. They reached the basement level. Arthur kicked the heavy fire door open, spilling them out into the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage. "Where?" Clara gasped, tasting iron from where she had bitten her tongue. "Sub-basement B," Arthur pointed, running toward a concrete ramp. "Secondary vehicle." They sprinted across the open expanse of concrete. Tires screeched violently on the level above them. The Moretti hit squad was flooding the garage. An armored black SUV was parked in the darkest corner of the lowest level. Arthur hit the remote unlock. 2 men rounded the corner of the ramp, raising assault rifles. "Get down!" Arthur yelled, diving behind a concrete pillar. The air filled with the deafening chatter of automatic fire. The windows of a nearby sedan shattered into a million glittering diamonds. Concrete dust rained down like snow. Clara hit the ground, crawling on her hands and knees toward the SUV. The roar of gunfire was absolute chaos, overwhelming her senses entirely. She reached the rear tire, curling herself into a tiny, terrified ball. Dominic stepped out from cover, entirely exposed. He fired short, controlled bursts. One of the gunmen dropped. The other scrambled back behind the ramp wall. "In the car!" Dominic shouted, grabbing the rear door handle and wrenching it open.